Hello everybody, and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope we're doing well, and today we'll be doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Space Jam 2 beat out Black Widow at the box office. But before we go into those numbers, please make sure that you smash that like button, light up that fire button if you're watching over on Odyssey, and make sure that you are subscribed to the channel with that bell notification turned on. That way you know every time a new video or live stream goes live on the channel. All right, so the weekend domestic chart for July 16th. Weekend of July 16th. What we have here is a very interesting scenario because Black Widow saw a pretty sizable 67% drop from week 1 to week 2, making the total domestic gross at this point $132 million, which is impressive by pandemic standards. However, not likely going to be enough for this movie to be able to actually make profitability when looking just at the raw box office numbers, but I'll get into that in just a second. Space Jam 2, on the other hand, coming in with $31.6 million, and that is indeed more than the $26 million that Black Widow made in its second weekend, which means Space Jam 2, a movie that, as a fan of Space Jam 1, I can say nobody wanted, nobody asked for, let alone with someone like LeBron James, somehow, someway, made $32.6 million. But don't you worry, that film likely will also be a massive flop, as it should be a massive flop, because again, no one wanted it or asked for it. And we also had another film come out called Escape Room. Okay, guess they're making escape room movies into horror films now, I guess, which came out at a very paltry 2.8 thousand. I don't know why I put 2.8, but anyway, over 2,000 theaters, a little less than 3,000 theaters, which is a little bit on the low side, but for a smaller budget escape room horror film, I guess that kind of makes sense in the end. But those were the top 3 movies of this past weekend. But the real story is when you dive further into the numbers of these top 2 movies. So let's go ahead and first off talk about Space Jam 2. Space Jam: A New Legacy. $54.6 million. People are like, oh my goodness, Space Jam is doing so well. It's overperforming. Impressive numbers. But then you forget, oh wait, the film cost $150 million to make at the box office. $150 million before marketing Space Jam 2 cost. When you look at that and then you remind yourself, okay, it made $54 million opening weekend. It cost $150 million, which means it costs, roughly around $225 million when you add in marketing? Not as impressive. Not as impressive. Now, of course, one wonders if Space Jam 2, since LeBron James is really good friends with the CCP and Chinese Communist China, if they're going to be able to maybe throw some shekels their way and be like, oh, look, we're going to show you how amazing LeBron is because he's always supported us in the past. We'll have to wait, of course, and see if that actually happens or not. I doubt it will, but with that being the case, this film is likely to be one of the biggest box office flops of the year, which I am totally fine with because, again, no one asked for it. Speaking about Black Widow, it is up to $264 million worldwide, which, if you watched my video from just a couple days ago, was around the number that a lot of people were saying was likely going to be the end result. And because this is the result at this point, I can start making some projections, and the projections don't look very good for this film. Even if this film performs at the highest end of my projections, it will be one of the lowest grossing films in Marvel history. And when I say lowest grossing, I mean actual net gains, net profits. It might be one of the worst performing, if not the worst performing Marvel film in history, and might actually be at the very least the worst film since Hulk when it comes to box office numbers, which, again, Hulk was the only film really up to this point that was a verifiable box office flop by those standards. Not looking good for Black Widow, which, according to some people, is the greatest Marvel film ever made. According to this guy, and reality, it's one of the worst objectively made films. And again, you can enjoy it. There's no problem with you subjectively enjoying any movie, but this film is not an objectively good movie. And I think this massive drop-off is a good indication that the word of mouth for this film is not nearly as strong as people like CinemaScore, which had you believe, where they claim, oh yeah, everyone gave it an A-. The overall average was an A- score from the audience. The audience is loving this movie. Look at Rotten Tomatoes. Look at this or that. I look at the numbers, and I look at the number and the drop-off, and I look at this in comparison to other Marvel films, and you can keep on saying, oh, but this is pandemic times. Yes. it still costs the same amount of money that any other Marvel film did before pandemic times. Which means, yeah, it might be doing well for the time period, but it's still going to cost Disney in the long run. Escape Room, again, don't know why a film like this was made, but hey, some people like these types of horror films. $13.3 million is what this film has made, and at a low budget, likely will be able to make its money back, I would imagine, but I'll be able to make an official prediction on that next week. And Fast 9, still one of the highest grossing films of the year at $591 million, but I will continue to remind everyone that $215 million of that came from China, of which they only get about a net gain of $50 million, and that number changes dramatically. And then when you take into account how much this film cost, which is roughly around $200 million, not as impressive as it looks. Again, don't get me wrong, that's a pretty high number, but when you especially compare that to the domestic and international numbers, you start to realize that, yeah, the actual profitability of the film is still very much in question. As, of course, Boss Baby 2 continues to not really make anything at the box office and is pretty much also a guaranteed flop at this point as well. So let's go ahead and go to my website, to the box office tracking tab. Check out my website, ombreviews.com, for box office tracking and tons of other stuff. And let's go ahead and do some charting here. So Space Jam 2, as I said, $54.6 million. We have Escape Room with $13.3 million as well. Let's go ahead and do some charting for Black Widow, which is the only film that is now in its second weekend where we can do these predictions as far as new predictions are concerned. So at $264 million, it means that at worst, this film will probably end up around $377 million worldwide. I could see the film doing a little bit more than this, but this is the lower end of the projections of what the final number will be, if indeed, at this point, for those that don't know how to read the chart, if this number, 264 million, is 70% of the entire future total of the movie, then that is what the future total would be, because 264 is 70% of 377, and then it's the same for 50%, same for 60%. And the reason why these are the percentages there is because based on research that I did years ago, what I found was that most movies make somewhere between 50 and 70% of their entire box office in the first 2 weeks. And so it's a pretty good range to have as far as, you know, what a film likely will do if it has good legs or if it doesn't have good legs. It's always weird to say that too, out of context as well, talking about legs as such. But the film will make somewhere between $377 million and $528 million, meaning that this film, obviously not having a China release, is going to not be the highest grossing film of the summer. And I think that anyone who is being honest here is going to look at that number and say, yeah, never would have thought that a Marvel film would be one of the lowest grossing film, or rather, sorry, not the highest grossing film of a summer season. And once again, people can try and spin it to say, well, it's COVID times, or hey, what about those Disney Plus numbers, which are not trustworthy, and we really cannot take Disney's word for it because this is the only film they have ever released numbers for, which is a bit convenient, I think, when they're trying to protect their, massive cash cow, which of course is the MCU. But the likely number probably will be somewhere around $450 million worldwide. But we'll, of course, keep on tracking that to see what the final number actually will be. Talking about some numbers here, as I said, with Space Jam 2, $150 million budget, meaning that the total cost with marketing is somewhere around $225 million, meaning that as of today, the film is looking at a $192 million loss. So seeing that this film will probably have somewhere around a 50% drop at least next week, this movie is going to be a massive, massive box office flop. Even if they're able to get their friends in China to give them some shekels, give them some money, because of the very little return on investment from the Chinese marketplace, it's not likely going to be enough for them to make any money back. And also, again, remember, this film is available for free on HBO Max if you have that subscription, which means that it's very easy to sail the high seas, probably to get a digital copy of this film too. So this film is pretty much dead in the water, even though everyone is trying to spin this as an impressive box office weekend for the film. Talking then about the Escape Room movie, coming in at $13.3 million. It cost around $15 million to make, $22.5 million with actual marketing cost, meaning the film is right now at a negative $14 million loss. So this film could maybe make its money back. But who knows exactly what kind of drop-off it's going to see. It wasn't available in a lot of theaters this week anyway, so this is one where it could really go either way. And to be honest, I have a feeling that the studio wasn't really expecting to make a massive profit on this movie and is going to be happy if it just makes a couple $1 million in actual net gain or net profit. All right, let's talk about the projections now for Black Widow as far as potential loss and potential gain. So as you can see, it's a pretty wide range here, but based on the number of 2 weeks in, $264 million. Right now, it's sitting at negative $141 million. So even if you still somehow count the 60 million, magic 60 million number that they were reporting from Disney Plus, still a massive financial loss at this point, has not made its money back. But based on just box office numbers, because that's all we can really trust since it's being reported by multiple places, it's being verified and checked by third-party outlets, etc. It can be tracked. It can be, again, there's receipts that we can actually look to actually be able to understand these numbers, whereas with Disney Plus, it's just take our word for it, I guess. But as you can see from this, the worst case scenario for Black Widow is that it ends up being a $73.7 million loss. The best case scenario is that it makes $16.8 million in profit. And again, as I said, that would make this film one of the worst performing films in the entire history of the MCU. If this film falls somewhere in that average and is a $28 million loss, that would make it the worst performing Marvel film in history. Because even Hulk, when it was indeed a box office flop, I don't remember it being that big of a box office flop. In fact, let me go ahead and let me see if I can fact check myself real quick, because I did a full breakdown of all of the Marvel films. And obviously, I adjusted for these inflation. I have not done any readjustments of these films. But let's see. That film, okay, so I would be incorrect in that. So that film ended up being around a $55 million loss back in 2008. And so this would still be in that territory, though, as far as potential losses, because, as I said, the biggest potential loss for this film would be $77 million. So theoretically, you could actually see the film be the worst film as far as box office performance is concerned in the entire MCU history, or at the very least be very close to The Incredible Hulk. So that is not a very good position for this film to be in, with one of the more popular characters in the MCU, in a film, obviously, that's been pushed off for years and years. People have been waiting for this film for a very long time. Obviously, that because of that long time, I think a lot of people gave up on this movie too, especially since the character is dead in the MCU. People thought, hey, why should I care about this film? And the film is just not a good movie to boot. All of those factors have to be taken into account to help, I think, people realize why the film is in the position that it is in, to really not be in a good position to make any money whatsoever. In fact, to potentially lose around $30 million or so. But as I said, it could make upwards of $16 million, which would be a very small profit in comparison to other MCU films. And again, just to bring up that chart over there, you can see other films in the franchises have made pretty big numbers as far as net gain, net profit, net grosses. I mean, even films like Ant-Man and the Wasp, which are one of the lower grossing of the actual movies, still ended up making around $182 million in net gain, net profit. So obviously people are going to try and spin this to say, hey, you know what? It's pandemic times, and we got to take into account Disney Plus, and so therefore that would make this film higher than all of those things. But even if you took all of that into account, you're still looking at a film that's going to be one of the lowest grossing films in the history of the entire MCU, and for a movie that is, again, a character that people know, that a character that people care about, a film that people have been wanting for a very long time, this is not looking good for future films like Shang-Chi, or like the Eternals, that are going to feature characters that no one knows, that a lot less people are going to actually care about as well. And we're still going to be in this pandemic era. We're still going to be in this era where not all the theaters are open. Not everyone is going back to the theater, where you're going to have a lot of people getting access to these movies, high quality versions of these movies on the high seas. And also, too, just people in general not wanting to go to see popcorn MCU films that have pretty much all hit this very boring formulaic structure, to the point of it being very predictable, very boring, and having characters played by actors that are just not all that interesting, and being directed by people that they are clearly getting on the cheap, who have no idea what they are doing. So all of these things, I think, are really spelling major danger for the future of the MCU and for Disney as well. And it makes a lot more sense as to why Disney is so hard pushing that $60 million number from Disney Plus. And I would not be surprised if they keep updating that number, because this will be one of the few movies where they're actually like, hey, we'll be totally transparent about our Disney Plus numbers for this movie, because we want to make it very clear. This movie's not a flop. This movie's not bad. Even though it lost to Space Jam 2. Again, lost to Space Jam 2. And is pretty much guaranteed at this point to be a financial failure and a financial loss for Disney. Yeah. Fun times indeed for Disneyland in general. And not the park. But yeah, you know what? I would add the park to that as well. But what are your thoughts about the box office for this weekend? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. If you like this video, smash that like button, light up that fire button if you're watching on Odyssey. It really does mean a lot. Also, make sure you subscribe to the channel and have that bell notification turned on. That way you know every time we do video or live stream goes live onto the channel. You're all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless. And now for a huge shout out to all of my July Patreon and Subscribe Star members: Andrew Hoyle, Biffer de Hobbit, Brian P., Dion, Don Bruno de la Mancha, Father Christopher Miller, hail to you, Father, Father Damian Cook, Garrett Searles, Harold Francis, Inflamed Wood, It's a Trap Productions, Jason Clark, Jacob Juice, Jeffrey Toone, Jonathan Carney, Laura the Modern Major General's Story, Mike Jackson, Mad Mitch Dunaway, Mr. Peabody and his evil twin with the beautiful hair, On to June, Orange Hat Reviews, Out of Step with Reality, Priscilla Hall, Riff Magos, Rosetta Allen, Teresa Martin, Theodore Bendon, Tina B, and Tina Bojan. Thank you all very much for supporting me over on Patreon, and also to my Subscribe Star members: Fast Reaction, Nosferatu Gatsu, John B, Perpetual Punster, Mr. Roy, Glinzer, J. Alex McCarthy Jr., Dean Heiss / the new number 2, J. Ra the Beer Guru, and ZK Man. And I also want to make sure to shout out my Locals members. I am now available over at locals.com, and I've got 2 monthly supporters over there. The first of my local supporters is Goblin Squatch. Shout out to you, good sir. And also, I now have a second supporter over on locals.com, and that is Robert Barnes. Shout out to both of you very much. Thank you very much for supporting me on that new platform at the Keeper of the Bifrost level. If you want to find out more information about that, go check out my Locals page. You can find the link in the description, and it tells you everything that you would get in that Keeper of the Bifrost level, which is right now the only level available on that platform. And I also want to make sure to shout out any new Patreon members, and for right now, I want to shout out Mondo Spieler, who is my newest member over on Patreon. Thank you all very much for being here today. And if you want to have your name shouted out at the end of every single live stream and video on the channel, please make sure to check out the links in the description of ways that you can support me over on Patreon and Subscribe Star as well. It gives you access to things like giveaways of Blu-rays, 4Ks, and digital codes. Also, access to a podcast that I do with John the Flick Pick Flickinger, where we have a lot of fun. We also answer Q&A questions as well. And also you might get access to the Chosen of Valhalla level, which gives you access to a once-a-month podcast exclusively where I bring on you to the main channel with everyone else who is at the level, and we all just talk about movies, pop culture, and tons of fun stuff like that. And also, of course, Tina, who is the Empress of the Universe, is going to give us tons of reviews of movies and also maybe a couple of awesome rants here and there as well. So if that sounds fun to you, make sure you go ahead and check out those links. Again, you're all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.